let's talk about the WNBA and the league's demise now that Caitlin Clark is no longer going to play this season. The WNBA and the Indiana Fever, Stephanie White, Amber Cox, all the way up and including, let's just keep it real, Kathy Engelbert, Adam Silver, the National Basketball Association, everybody that participated in
The biggest nightmare for the WNBA has just become a devastating reality. Caitlin Clark, the single most important athlete the league has ever seen, is done for the season. Her year is over in the most brutal way possible. And this isn't just a story about a simple injury. This is a story of complete and total systemic failure, a collapse of an entire business model that was built on one player's shoulders, and a warning sign that the entire future of women's professional basketball is now hanging by a thread. The Indiana Fever organization, coaches, executives, and every single official tied to this league are now facing a firestorm fury. And the question on everyone's mind is painfully simple. How did they let this happen? Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel with notifications on, because what we're about to break down is one of the most shocking stories in sports this year.
Caitlin Clark out for the remainder of the 2025 season, something we all think we knew was coming after what Stephanie White said earlier today. We couldn't be too sure until we see it for ourselves. And with this announcement from the GOAT's mouth herself, Caitlin Clark won't be returning this season, nor if the Indiana Fever make.
It all started with a pattern, a deliberate and ugly strategy that began the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto the WNBA floor. During her rookie season, she was on the receiving end of a staggering 20% of all the flagrant fouls called in the entire league. Think about that. One player absorbing a fifth of the most violent plays. This statistic wasn't just a number. It was a neon sign pointing to a culture of enabled hostility. Analysts and former players began calling it out on broadcasts, noting that the treatment went beyond competitive physicality into the realm of targeted intimidation. And many of these weren't just hard basketball moves. They were blatant, often off-the-ball hits, shoves, and grabs that had nothing to do with the game. Opponents, most notably Angel Reese in the Chicago Sky, would hammer Clark on cuts, shove her off screens, and then the most insulting part, they would stand over her and laugh. They laughed. It was a spectacle of disrespect, a public targeting that played out in front of millions. Social media erupted after each incident, with clips of the hard fouls and the reactions going viral, creating a narrative that the league was failing to control its own product.
Well, it all started last year, in her rookie season, where she received 20% of all the flagrant fouls in the league. And most of them came from Angel Reese in the Chicago Sky. And these weren't basketball plays. They were not only fouling her, but they were getting up, laughing about it, laughing about Caitlin Clark getting assaulted. Any other work environment, people go to jail for what's going on.
This created a toxic environment where it seemed that enforcing the rules wasn't priority, but making a statement against the new star was. In any other environment outside of the sports arena, this kind of repeated physical targeting would be unthinkable, a clear violation of conduct. But in the WNBA, it became Tuesday night, a weekly ritual that everyone saw but no one in power seemed willing to stop, creating a brewing storm of frustration among a massive new fan base that felt their hero was being unfairly punished for her own success. The physical toll of this abuse was a ticking time bomb, and everyone was watching the countdown. It began subtly in May with a nagging quad strain, an injury often related to overcompensation and fatigue. Then as the constant, uncalled contact continued, the issues migrated and intensified. A recurring groin problem flared up all through June and July, slowing down her explosive first step, that very thing that made her game so electric. Sports medicine experts often talk about the concept of cumulative trauma, where smaller, repeated impacts lead to a significant breakdown. This wasn't a single torn ligament from one bad fall. It was a body systematically worn down by hundreds of unchecked collisions.
It's how much it was just Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark was taking all the hits. Caitlin Clark was taking all the abuse. But this year they've added Sophie Cunningham. She gets more flagrant fouls on her than anybody in the league besides Caitlin Clark. And Aaliyah Boston, she's been taking hits as well. But the worst thing is the consistency. So they don't call flagrant fouls, or most of the time, Caitlin Clark could be held for an entire game at a time. They don't call fouls. They don't call common fouls.
She was clearly laboring, grimacing through plays that used to be effortless. Her shooting percentage dipped. Her drives to the basket became less frequent, and the spark that defined her plays seemed to dim. But the league machine had to keep rolling. The arenas were sold out, the TV contracts were locked in, and the sponsors demanded their star. So she played on, absorbing more punishment through a grueling travel schedule and back-to-back games, a workload that would challenge any veteran, let alone a rookie. The demand for her to be on the court was immense, creating an impossible situation where rest and recovery were not viable options, pushing her further toward the edge. Until the inevitable finally happened in August, a brutal bone bruise that shattered any hope of finishing the season. Her body didn't just fail. It broke down piece by piece under the weight of relentless, unprotected contact. This wasn't a mystery. It was a slow-motion catastrophe that every fan saw unfolding in real time, a preventable tragedy that unfolded right before our eyes. The most infuriating part of this entire disaster is the staggering hypocrisy. On one hand, the WNBA embraced Caitlin Clark as its golden goose. They paraded every financial metric she created, record-breaking ticket sales, merchandise flying off the shelves, massive new sponsorship deals, and television ratings that dwarfed anything the league had ever seen before. Internal reports suggested franchise valuations saw their most significant jump in 2 decades, all directly correlated with her arrival. She single-handedly packed NBA-sized arenas on the road, from Vegas to New York to Dallas, turning road games into must-see events and introducing the WNBA to an entirely new demographic of sports fans. The entire economic explosion of the WNBA was tied directly to her name and her game. Yet, when it came to reciprocating that value, the league and its officials treated her like just another rookie. They refused to give her the same superstar whistle that is a standard protective measure in every other professional sports league, a practice designed to protect marketable assets from injury. Night after night, defenders were allowed to hand-check her, clothesline her on cuts, and shove her out of plays without a whistle. It was a baffling contradiction. Her stardom was valuable enough to sell everything, but not valuable enough to protect. The league was more than happy to sell the product, but they utterly refused to protect the product's most vital component, treating her as both the centerpiece and the collateral damage of their own success story, a dangerous game that ultimately backfired in the most devastating way possible. And let's be clear, while Clark was a primary target, the league's failure in protecting its players wasn't isolated to just her. This context is crucial to understand the full scope of the problem. Players like Sophie Cunningham and Aaliyah Boston were also taking an excessive number of hard hits, accumulating flagrant fouls, and playing through constant physicality. The issue was one of consistency or a complete lack thereof. The officiating was so inconsistent and seemingly arbitrary that common fouls weren't being called, let alone the more dangerous ones. This created an environment where physical play escalated without consequence, encouraging a style of basketball that prioritized rugged defense over skillful offense. Players and coaches across the league began to speak out, frustrated by a rulebook that seemed to be applied differently from game to game and from quarter to quarter. This lack of a standard set a dangerous precedent, normalizing a level of contact that many felt was detrimental to the quality and safety of the game. But the focus remained laser-sharp on Clark because her value was so astronomically higher, and the consequences of her absence were so much more severe. The failure to protect her was a failure of the highest order, a negligent disregard for the very engine of their growth. The league was cashing checks written by Caitlin Clark, while allowing her to be the punching bag, a stark symbol of a broader systemic issue that put all players at risk. When the situation reached its breaking point and Clark was finally sidelined for good, fans waited for a response from the top. They waited for accountability, for leadership, for someone to simply acknowledge what millions had witnessed for months. They expected a sober assessment of the officiating and a commitment to player safety. What they got from Commissioner Kathy Engelbert was nothing short of a slap in the face. Her response was a hollow, corporate, sanitized statement filled with vague talk about growth and the future of the league. It was a masterclass in saying nothing, carefully avoiding any specific mention of the controversies, the injuries, or the clear breakdown in on-court governance. She spoke of record revenues and expansion teams, touting the very success that Clark had engineered, while ignoring the crisis that her absence now created. There was no acknowledgement of the targeting, no admission that the referees had failed in their duty to protect the player, no contrition for the league's role in this disaster. It was profit talk and PR spin, completely divorced from the reality of the anger and betrayal felt by the fans. That moment revealed everything. It showed that the leadership was utterly out of touch, more concerned with protecting its image and projecting strength than addressing the painful truth and showing humility. This response didn't calm the waters. It poured gasoline on the fire, confirming the worst fears of every fan who believed the league saw players as commodities, not people. The backlash from the fans was instant, brutal, and financially devastating. The hype bubble, built entirely on Clark's presence, violently popped. It wasn't a slow leak. It was a puncture that drained all the air out of the season in one fell swoop. The immediate economic shockwave was most visible on the secondary ticket market. Just days after the official announcement, the average resale price for Indiana Fever home games plummeted by over 70%. Courtside seats that once commanded thousands of dollars were now being listed for a few hundred, with few takers. The league's marquee event, the All-Star Weekend in Indianapolis, which is supposed to be her grand showcase and a coronation of the new era she ushered in, was hit the hardest. Packages that included meet and greets and premium access, once sold out in minutes, were now being offered at deep discounts in desperate email blasts from the league itself. The event transformed from a celebration into a somber reminder of what had been lost. The visual evidence was even more damning. Arenas that were packed just weeks earlier, buzzing with energy unfamiliar to many WNBA venues, suddenly had vast swaths of empty seats. Broadcasts of Fever games, would have been a showcase for a revitalized sport, now panned across sections of blue and yellow plastic. The atmosphere was palpably different. The deafening cheers that greeted Clark's every move were replaced by a quieter, more subdued crowd, the life and new energy having been sucked out of the building. The Clark effect wasn't just a theory, it was a tangible force, and its absence was just as powerful and visible. The ripple effects extended far beyond the turnstiles. Television networks that had gambled primetime slots on her drawing power watched their ratings nosedive. Games featuring the Fever that once rivaled MLB broadcasts in viewership now struggled to maintain their pre-Clark averages. This presented a serious long-term problem. The league's next round of media rights negotiations was looming, and executives were now forced to question whether the historic surge was a permanent new plateau or a temporary bubble that had now burst. Sponsors who paid a premium for courtside signage and integrated advertising campaigns tied to the Clark effect found their money was now tied to a product nobody wanted to watch without its main attraction. Several major brands, in a move that sent shockwaves through the league office, quietly began renegotiating their contracts, arguing that the value proposition they had signed up for was no longer valid. The financial foundation of the league's recent growth began to look incredibly fragile, but it went beyond money. This was personal for the millions of new fans Clark had brought to the game. They organized boycotts, using social media to coordinate efforts to cancel season tickets and avoid watching games. Hashtags like #ProtectTheStars and #WNBA Accountability began trending, filled with angry testimonials from heartbroken parents whose young daughters now saw a league that didn't protect its brightest role model. They felt sold a lie, strung along with vague, day-to-day injury reports of a quad strain, when many insiders and fans believed the league, and the team knew the severity of the cumulative damage all along. This perceived lack of transparency was a critical error, transforming disappointment into outright betrayal. The trust that took one magical rookie season to build, a trust built on thrilling performances, and the joy of discovering a new sport, was incinerated in a matter of days. The audience felt that the league had taken their passion and their money for granted, exposing a fundamental disconnect between the front office and the very people it needed to survive. This wasn't just a dip in popularity. It was a full-blown crisis of confidence that struck at the heart of the WNBA's relationship with its newfound fan base, revealing that the league's newfound success was built on a far more fragile foundation than anyone had dared to admit. So where does this leave us? Caitlin Clark's season is over, and the WNBA is left staring into the abyss of its own creation. This was not an accident. It was a direct, predictable result of a league that prioritized short-term profit and ticket sales over the long-term health of its most valuable asset and the trust of its fans. They refused to protect their star, they refused to call fouls, and they refused to be honest. Now the bill has come due. The question is no longer about when Clark will return. She will, and she'll likely come back stronger. The real existential question is whether the WNBA itself can survive the self-inflicted wound. Once you show your audience that profit matters more than player safety, that hype matters more than honesty, there may be no coming back. The league had a once-in-a-generation star handed to them on a silver platter, and they fumbled away in just 13 games. If this story shocked you, let us know in the comments what you think the WNBA needs to do to fix this mess. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the biggest stories in sports.